just reading over a passage of Nietzsche's that is not from this book. And by the way, this book, I don't know why you chose The Will to Power, because it's really not a book. I mean, and you're going to have some considerable problems with it. You're going to have to go through and just pick out the aphorisms. They are, I mean, Nietzsche as Nietzsche from the very beginning. I mean, in all of his writings is, of course, extremely difficult, elusive, somehow expecting a certain kind of cultivation on the part of his readers, which we no longer have, and which he, doesn't point to. It's not like the problem of Kant. I mean, Kant is difficult to read, but he tells who his sources are. He, in a way, speaks to universal reason, and although perhaps to understand the real meaning of Kant, you have to know a whole world. There is a meaning that is, simply the universal meaning conveyed by reason, but Nietzsche is so much appealing to a common experience, which of course at the same time he's trying to preserve. You can say that experience, and I think that has to be pointed out to the students, is the experience on the one hand of classical antiquity, particularly the Greeks, and above all Greek tragic poetry, but also Plato, and on the other the experience of the biblical religions, Judaism, and particularly, of course, Christianity. And he implies a deep knowledge of, a deep sympathy with, and also a struggle against those two roots. And both have had a tendency to disappear. In a way, we've solved the problem of the tension. Nietzsche describes our soul as a kind of bow, with two ends which is very difficult to string, but the string has an enormous tautness, and it is out of that bow that one will project the new values that he hopes and expects that man will be able to set for himself. And of course, you can say part of the American educational way has been to unbend the bow, again, to use a Nietzschean expression, by just not giving us that information any longer. This is, by the way, I mean, in a private way, I'd like to hear from some of you about this. As a teacher, over the years, I always, when I began teaching, I said, well, Americans don't know anything. I didn't know anything when I was 18. And you begin tabula rasa, it's a wonderful thing. But I didn't realize how much they had in them, just sort of instinctively, from their old religious training, certain kinds of family relations, and so on. And my feeling has been that this has been going down year by year, so that there's almost no bow whatsoever to begin with, or that the soil is very thin. That this has been the problems of education, that the past longings. Let me say, in this context, one of the things that's very striking is that I'm finding that a disproportionate number of good students now are Catholic, or at least of Catholic training, because they seem to carry more of the past with them. I mean, frequently just in the mere reminder that a bad conscience brings, but which it can be a stimulus, to serious education. But the will to power is a very great problem because of the difficulty of Nietzsche's writing in general. And here he is. It's not a completed book. It's very hard for the teacher himself to figure out to what he can attribute to what he can say is really serious, developed, what the real intentions of the book are, and so on. Of course, there are many wonderful things in it, wonderful observations, but again, this is a problem because the most wonderful observations of Nietzsche are psychological observations, psychological in the broader sense, the possible states of soul. And he is marvelous in describing, characterizing the phenomena that go on. Well, young people, and particularly our young people, don't tend to be very subtle analysts of their experiences, their moods. They're told what they feel. They have the categories given to them, in large measure. So one has to turn them to it. But I wanted to begin with the famous passage, and it might be useful for you as teachers to do so, for the Last Man passage from Zarathustra, because it, in some sense, states the beginning point. Perhaps I should say the following. I mean, I had meant to say this in my in the remarks, that I think part of the success of Nietzsche in the United States has come from its assimilation into Marxism. You see, the great movement. I mean, Nietzsche is clearly a right winger, if you'll forgive that crude formulation, but it is important that one recognize that, because Nietzsche is so elusive that one has to stick on things that are really clear and which they will understand. We'll come back to this, but he's against democracy, he's against notions of human rights. Above all, and perhaps this would allow for some of the best discussion in class, if when the best one means most heated, he's absolutely against the equality of women. Feminism, he regards that as absolutely essential. I mean, we'll try to explain why, and there's some good remarks in here that one can refer to. Nietzsche is that he is a figure who said, modernity, and modernity means democracy and ultimately socialism, is on the one hand the decadence of man, necessarily the decadence of man, and leads to, or is not really leads to, but is the true expression of nihilism, the real belief in nothing, and that it is the deepest and perhaps fatal misunderstanding of the nature of things, and hence particularly of man. And it is one of the great achievements of the left to have incorporated Nietzsche, because if you hear Nietzsche talk, I think you'll see it's mostly on the left today. That's been since the Second World War. The whole school of criticism called deconstructionism is nothing but that, an attempt. You see, deconstructionism, I mean, in the simplest sense, is a circus act. You cut the woman up into pieces, the magician, and then you put her back together. That's that's what they do to Nietzsche. They cut him up, put him back together, and he's a leftist. After the circus, after the circus act, and I think the simplest way in which Nietzsche moved to the left, Nietzsche's description of modern man, which is very impressive, can be easily assimilated to Marx's understanding of the bourgeois. It's much profounder, obviously. You can say, well, Nietzsche says this is the last man, this is what we are heading to. Marx says, no, this is a stage, we're going to get beyond it, after the revolution. And this has allowed the left to, at least to make a plausible case, because this is a description of the men of our times, and that's the bourgeoisie. That's what we have to get rid of. And that would, much more easily allow for the revolution. And precisely because Nietzsche is a much profounder describer, spectator of man than Marx, and takes much more seriously the intimate experiences, which somehow the economic explanation does not. Without the Nietzschean element, Marx, how should I say, without the Nietzschean element, I think that Marxism would have died completely, that the appeal of contemporary